The sound of the auctioneer's gavel striking wood echoed through the dusty streets of Johnson City, Texas. But Garrett Jenkins barely heard it as he stood outside the general store, scanning the faces of passing strangers with growing desperation. It was the summer of 1876, and the brutal Texas heat seemed to press down on everything like a weight, making even breathing feel like work. Garrett had been searching for help for 3 months now, ever since his last ranch hand had quit without warning, leaving him alone to manage 200 acres and nearly 100 head of cattle. Every man he approached either wanted wages he could not afford or took one look at his struggling ranch and walked away shaking their heads. He was about to give up for the day when he noticed a woman standing near the edge of the wooden sidewalk, her carpetbag clutched in both hands like it contained everything she owned in the world. Her dress was worn but clean, mended in several places with careful stitches that spoke of pride despite poverty. Dark hair escaped from beneath a faded bonnet, and her face, though lined with exhaustion, held a determined set to the jaw that caught his attention. What struck him most was the way people walked past her as though she were invisible, or worse, as though they saw her and deliberately looked away. Garrett had felt that kind of rejection himself lately, the slow erosion of dignity that came with being passed over again and again. He approached her carefully, removing his hat as he drew near. She tensed immediately, her knuckles whitening on the handle of her bag. "Madam, forgive my boldness," he said, keeping his voice low and respectful, "but you look like someone who might be seeking work." Her eyes, he noticed, were a striking gray, like storm clouds before rain. They studied him with a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned. "What kind of work?" "I have a cattle ranch about 5 miles outside town. It is not much, truth be told, and I cannot pay what most hands expect. But I can offer room, board, and what wages I can manage once I sell the herd in autumn. I need help with everything from mending fences to working the cattle. It is hard work, dawn to dusk most days." She searched his face for signs of deception or worse intentions. Garrett stood still under her scrutiny, letting her take her time. He had nothing to hide except his desperation, and that was probably written all over him anyway. "Why ask me?" she finally said. "Why not hire one of the men standing over by the saloon?" "Those men have made it clear they want nothing to do with my ranch," Garrett said honestly. "And you look like someone who understands what it means to need a chance when nobody else is offering one." Something flickered in her expression, a recognition perhaps. "My name is Margaret Norris. I have been in this town for 2 days, and no respectable establishment will hire me. Would you like to know why? Only if you want to tell me." She seemed surprised by that answer. "I was married to a man who robbed a bank in San Antonio. He was shot during the robbery, died in jail before they could hang him. That was 8 months ago. I had nothing to do with his crimes, but his name became mine when we married, and now everyone assumes I am either a criminal myself or bad luck waiting to happen. I have been turned away from boarding houses, restaurants, laundries, even a job mucking out stables." Garrett considered this, aware that she was watching him closely for his reaction. "Were you involved in the robbery?" "No." "Do you know how to work hard?" "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I can handle livestock, mend things, cook, clean, and I am not afraid of getting dirty or tired." "Then I do not care what your husband did," Garrett said simply. "I need help, and it sounds like you need work. If you are willing, I can offer you employment." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her eyes grow bright with unshed tears that she blinked away quickly. When she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. "I will not let you down." Those words hung in the hot afternoon air between them, weighted with more meaning than a simple promise. Garrett heard in them the echo of his own silent vow, the determination to prove that his failing ranch could be saved, that he was not the disappointment everyone in town seemed to think he was. "My wagon is this way," he said, gesturing down the street. "We can load your bag and head out before dark. I should warn you, the ranch house is not fancy. It is just me living there since my father passed last year. There is a spare room that was meant for hired hands. It has a good lock on the door, and I give you my word that you will be safe there." Margaret nodded slowly, adjusting her grip on her carpet bag. "I appreciate you saying that." They walked together to where Garrett's wagon stood waiting, hitched to two sturdy horses that had seen better days but were still reliable. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, then climbed up beside her. As they rolled out of Johnson City, Garrett was acutely aware of the stares that followed them, the whispers that started up behind hands. He set his jaw and kept his eyes forward, wondering if he had just made his life easier or considerably more complicated. The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour along a rutted road that cut through scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. The sun beat down relentlessly, and dust rose from the wagon wheels in pale clouds. Margaret sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the harsh landscape with an expression he could not quite read. "It is not much to look at," Garrett found himself saying, breaking the silence. "But the land is good enough if you can coax it. My father bought this property 15 years ago, thinking he would build something lasting. He worked himself into an early grave trying to make that dream real. I am trying to honor what he started, but it has been harder than I expected. Running a ranch alone is nearly impossible," Margaret said. "No shame in needing help. Tell that to the men in town who think I should sell out and move on. Maybe they are wrong." Garrett glanced at her, surprised by the quiet conviction in her voice. "You do not even know me or my ranch." "No, but I know what it is like to have everyone tell you that you have failed before you have even had a fair chance to try. Sometimes the people who say it cannot be done just do not want to see you succeed." There was a bitterness in her words that Garrett understood all too well. They fell back into silence, but it felt more comfortable now, the silence of two people who recognized something of themselves in each other. When the ranch finally came into view, Garrett saw it through her eyes and felt a familiar mix of pride and disappointment. The house was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs and sun-bleached planks, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It needed paint and some repair work, but it was solid enough. The barn was larger, though its roof had a sag in the middle that worried him. Corrals extended out from the barn, and beyond them, the pasture stretched away toward distant hills where his cattle grazed. "The fence needs work in several places," Garrett said as he pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. "And the barn roof will need replacing before winter. There are a dozen other projects I have been putting off because I could not manage them alone. But the cattle are healthy, and the land has water, which is more than many can say out here." Margaret climbed down from the wagon before he could offer assistance, her movements practiced and efficient. She stood for a moment, surveying the property with a critical eye that missed nothing. "Where do you want me to start? How about I show you where you will be staying first, let you settle in a bit? We can go over everything else after supper." He led her into the house, aware of how sparse and masculine it looked, with none of the touches that made a place feel like a home rather than just a shelter. The main room held a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, and a table with 3 mismatched chairs. A kitchen area occupied one corner, and a narrow staircase led up to the second floor. "Your room is up here," Garrett said, climbing the stairs. He opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a small space with a simple bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out over the back pasture. It is not much, but the roof does not leak, and like I said, the door has a good lock. My room is downstairs on the other side of the house, so you will have privacy up here." Margaret set her carpet bag on the bed, her fingers trailing over the quilt that covered it. "This is more than I expected." "Thank you. I will let you get settled. Come down when you are ready and we can figure out supper." Garrett retreated downstairs, giving her space. He stood in the main room, suddenly seeing all the little failures that had accumulated over the past year. The dishes piled in the wash basin, the dust on every surface, the general air of neglect that came from a man too tired and discouraged to care about anything beyond surviving one more day. He had not realized how far he had let things slip until now, when someone else would be sharing this space. He was washing the accumulated dishes when Margaret came back downstairs, having removed her bonnet and tidied her hair. She surveyed the kitchen area with the same critical eye she had turned on the property. "When did you last have a proper meal?" "I have been eating just fine." "That was not what I asked." Garrett paused in his dishwashing, considering. "I honestly cannot remember. I have been making do with whatever is quickest." Margaret rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what supplies you have." They worked together preparing supper, and Garrett was struck by how natural it felt to have someone else moving through the space, how the house seemed to wake up with her presence in it. She found flour and lard, some dried beans he had forgotten about, and managed to create a meal that was simple but better than anything he had eaten in months. They ate at the table as the sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Tell me about the cattle," Margaret said between bites. "What breed? How many head exactly?" "Mostly longhorns, some mixed breeding. I counted 93 last week, but I need to do another count soon. They range pretty far and I have lost track of some of them. That is part of the problem. With just me trying to keep track of everything, things fall through the cracks." "We will do a proper count tomorrow," Margaret said. "Get a real sense of what we are working with. Then we can prioritize the repairs based on what is most urgent." Garrett looked at her across the table, this woman who had been in his life for mere hours, but was already speaking of his problems as though they were shared challenges to be solved together. "You really meant it, did you not, when you said you would not let me down?" "I always mean what I say, Mr. Jenkins." "Garrett, please. If we are going to be working together, might as well use given names." "Then you should call me Margaret." They finished the meal and cleaned up together, establishing a rhythm that would become familiar in the days to come. Garrett showed her where things were kept, the quirks of the pump that required a specific kind of handling, the way the door to the pantry stuck unless you lifted while pulling. Small details of a life he had been living alone, now being shared. That night, lying in his bed on the ground floor, Garrett listened to the sounds of another person moving around upstairs, the creak of floorboards, the quiet closing of a door. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the house did not feel empty. He fell asleep thinking about Margaret's gray eyes and the determined set of her jaw, about the promise she had made, and his own silent vow to prove that taking a chance on each other had been the right choice for them both. The next morning arrived with the pale pink light of dawn filtering through Garrett's window. He woke to the smell of coffee brewing, which was so unexpected that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. But no, there were footsteps downstairs, the clatter of pans, the reality of another person in his house. He dressed quickly and headed down to find Margaret already in the kitchen, her hair braided back practically, wearing the same worn dress but with an apron tied over it. "You are up early," Garrett said. "Dawn is when the day starts on a ranch," Margaret replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. I figured we should get started on that cattle count while it is still cool enough to move around without melting. They ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush and set out together as the sun was just clearing the horizon. Margaret proved as capable as she had claimed, sitting a horse with ease and reading the land with an experienced eye. They spent the morning riding through the pastures, finding cattle scattered across the property. Some were in good condition, but others showed signs of neglect, and they found 2 calves that had gotten separated from their mothers and were looking worse for wear. "These 2 need to be brought closer to the house where we can keep an eye on them," Margaret said, maneuvering her horse to gently herd the calves. "They will not survive out here on their own much longer." Garrett helped her guide the calves back toward the barn, impressed by her calm confidence with the animals. They worked through the heat of midday, pausing only briefly to drink from canteens filled with well water. By the time the sun was beginning its descent, they had counted 87 head, which meant at least 6 were still unaccounted for. "Could be they have wandered onto neighboring property," Margaret said as they rode back toward the house. "Or they might be in that far section we have not reached yet. We should check there tomorrow." "How do you know so much about this?" Garrett asked. "You said you grew up on a farm, but this is clearly more than that." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "My father raised cattle in Missouri before he passed. I worked alongside him from the time I was big enough to sit a horse. After he died, my mother remarried, and her new husband had no use for a daughter who thought she knew about ranching. That is when I left, ended up making some poor choices, including the man I married." "We all make choices we regret," Garrett said. "What matters is what we do after." "Is that what you tell yourself about this ranch?" The question could have been unkind, but her tone was curious rather than critical. Garrett found himself answering honestly. "My father wanted this place to be something grand, a legacy to leave behind. I think he would be disappointed to see how I have struggled with it. Some days I wonder if I am holding on out of stubbornness rather than sense. Or maybe you are holding on because something in you knows it is worth saving," Margaret said. "Not every crop grows on the first planting. Sometimes the ground needs more work before it yields anything worthwhile." They reached the barn and dismounted, working together to tend to the horses and settle the calves they had rescued into a pen where they could be monitored and fed. The work was hot and tiring, but there was a satisfaction in it that Garrett had not felt in a long time, the sense that progress was being made, that he was not fighting a losing battle alone. Over supper that evening, they made plans for the coming days, outlining priorities and dividing tasks. Margaret had a mind for organization that Garrett lacked, able to see how different projects connected, and which order made the most sense for tackling them. They would finish counting the cattle, then move on to the most critical fence repairs before assessing what could be done about the barn roof. "It will take money to hire help for that roof," Margaret said. "More than you probably have right now. But if we can get everything else in order, improve the condition of the herd, you should get a better price when you take them to market in the fall. That could give you enough to make the major repairs before winter. You think we can turn this around in a few months? I think we can make a good start. The rest will depend on factors beyond our control, weather and market prices and luck. But you have been trying to do alone what requires at least 2 people. Now you have help. That changes the equation." Garrett wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the small spark of hope he felt growing in his chest was based on reality rather than wishful thinking. But Margaret spoke with such practical certainty, backing up her confidence with knowledge and a willingness to work, that it was hard not to be convinced. The days that followed fell into a pattern that became almost comfortable. They rose with the sun and worked until dark, pausing only for quick meals and brief rests during the worst heat of midday. They found the missing cattle, all 6 of them gathered in a far corner of the property where a spring provided good water. They mended fences, replaced rotted posts, cleared brush that had encroached on grazing areas. Margaret proved invaluable in 100 small ways, her experience and practical knowledge filling gaps Garrett had not even realized existed in his own understanding. But it was more than just her skill with ranch work that made a difference. The house began to feel different, cared for in ways it had not been since before his father's death. She cleaned and organized without making a fuss about it, just quietly bringing order to chaos in whatever spare moments she could find. She cooked proper meals that gave them both the energy to keep working hard. She even found time to mend his worn shirts, her needle moving with quick precision while they sat on the porch in the evenings, talking about the day's work and plans for tomorrow. Garrett found himself looking forward to those evening conversations, to the sound of her voice and the way she challenged his assumptions without being confrontational. She had opinions on everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation, and she was not shy about sharing them. At the same time, she listened when he spoke, really listened, considering his words rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. It was during one of these evening talks, about 3 weeks after Margaret had arrived, that Garrett realized how much he had come to value her presence beyond the practical help she provided. They were discussing whether to sell all the cattle in fall or hold back some breeding stock, a complicated decision with risks either way. Margaret was arguing for keeping the best animals to build the herd, while Garrett worried about having enough money to make it through the winter. "You are thinking too short-term," Margaret said, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she worked on the shirt in her lap. "Yes, selling everything gives you immediate cash. But then you start from scratch next year, buying new stock and hoping you got decent animals. If you keep your best breeders, you are investing in the future of this ranch. If we have a future," Garrett said, "if we can make it through the winter." Margaret set down her mending and looked at him directly. "Do you want to know what I really think, always? I think you are afraid to believe this place can succeed, because then you might be disappointed when it does not. I think you have spent so long preparing for failure that you do not know how to prepare for success." Her words hit harder than Garrett expected, striking at a truth he had been avoiding. "Maybe you are right. After watching my father work himself to death for this land after a year of struggling alone, it got easier to expect the worst. At least then I was not surprised when things went wrong." "But that is no way to live," Margaret said gently. "And it is no way to run a ranch. You have to believe in what you are building, Garrett, or why bother building it at all?" "I am starting to believe again," he admitted. "Since you arrived, I am starting to think maybe this is possible after all." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of words that meant more than they said on the surface. Margaret picked up her mending again, but Garrett noticed a slight flush in her cheeks that had not been there before. "Well, that is good then. Belief is important." They sat in companionable silence for a while, but Garrett's mind was racing. He was beginning to understand that what he felt for Margaret went beyond gratitude for her help on the ranch. He enjoyed her company, looked forward to seeing her each morning, found himself watching her when she was not looking, admiring the way she moved with such purpose and grace even when doing the hardest work. The realization both excited and worried him. He had hired her as help, offered her employment when no one else would. Getting romantically involved could complicate everything, especially if she did not share his feelings. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Garrett and Margaret were working on replacing a section of fence when they heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders crested the hill, and Garrett recognized them with a sinking feeling. Walter Price owned the neighboring ranch, a much larger and more successful operation. The two men with him were his sons, both in their 20s and known for being trouble when they had been drinking. "Jenkins," Walter called out as they rode up. "Heard you hired yourself some help." "News travels fast," Garrett replied evenly, setting down the post he had been positioning. Walter's eyes moved to Margaret and his expression hardened. "That is the Norris woman, is it not, the bank robber's widow?" "Miss Norris is working for me, yes. What business is it of yours?" "Just being neighborly," Walter said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Wanted to warn you that folks in town are talking. Wondering what kind of man hires a woman like that, what kind of arrangement you two might have." Garrett felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Miss Norris is an employee, nothing more or less, and I do not give a damn what people in town are saying." "You should care," one of Walter's sons said, leaning forward in his saddle. "Reputation matters out here. You associate with the wrong kind of people, you will find yourself cut off, unable to get supplies on credit, unable to hire help when you need it." Margaret stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be intimidated by gossip and innuendo. My husband's crimes are not mine to bear, and any decent person would recognize that." "Decent," Walter snorted. "Out here decent is as decent does. And a woman alone, working on a ranch with an unmarried man living in the same house. That looks a certain way, no matter what the truth of it is." "Then people with dirty minds can think what they like," Garrett said, his voice hard. "I need help running this ranch, and Miss Norris has proven herself more capable than any man I tried to hire. That is all that matters to me. Now, if you will excuse us, we have work to do." Walter studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You are making a mistake, Jenkins. But I guess you will figure that out soon enough. Come on, boys." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Garrett turned to Margaret, who stood very still, her face pale but composed. "I am sorry about that." "It is not your fault," she said. "I knew this would happen sooner or later. I just hoped we would have more time before the gossip started affecting you." "It does not affect me. I do not care what they think." "But you should care," Margaret said, echoing the words that had been thrown at them. "Your reputation in this community is tied to your ability to do business, to succeed with this ranch. If people start treating you like a pariah because of me, that could destroy everything you are working toward." "Then they can all go to hell," Garrett said with more force than he intended. "I will not fire you because of small-minded gossip. You have worked harder and done more for this ranch in 3 weeks than anyone has in the past year. You have kept your promise to me, and I intend to keep mine to you." Margaret's eyes shone with emotion. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you. But I want you to understand, if it becomes too much, if the consequences become too severe, I will leave. I will not let my past destroy your future. It will not come to that." But Garrett wondered if he was making a promise he could keep. The visit from Walter Price troubled him more than he wanted to admit, not because of the social pressure, but because he realized his feelings for Margaret made him vulnerable in ways he had not anticipated. If people thought their relationship was improper, what would they think if it actually became something more? And yet he could not bring himself to regret hiring her, could not imagine going back to the lonely isolation of working this ranch alone. They finished the fence repair in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. That evening, the easy conversation on the porch was stilted, weighted down by things unsaid. Garrett wanted to reassure Margaret that everything would be fine, but he could not be certain it was true. The reality of their situation, the way it would be perceived by others, had been forced into the open, and there was no ignoring it now. The situation came to a head a week later when Garrett went into town for supplies. The general store owner, who had always been friendly enough, was cool and distant. When Garrett tried to arrange credit until he could sell his cattle in the fall, the owner shook his head. "Sorry, Jenkins, I cannot extend you credit anymore. Policy has changed." "Since when?" "Since now. I have got a business to run, and I cannot afford to be associated with questionable situations." Garrett felt his jaw tighten. What exactly is questionable about a man hiring help to run his ranch? The store owner had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Look, I am not saying anything is going on. But appearances matter, and the fact is you have got that woman living in your house, and people are talking. I have got to think about my own reputation." Garrett left the store without the supplies he needed, anger simmering beneath his skin. He made stops at 2 other businesses and received similar treatment, polite but firm rejections. The message was clear. He was being punished for employing Margaret, for defying the social expectations of what was proper. He rode back to the ranch in a dark mood, unsure what to do next. They needed those supplies, and his credit had been essential to his plan for making it through until the cattle sale. Without it, everything became more precarious. He was so preoccupied with these worries that he almost missed the sound of voices as he approached the house. Margaret was standing near the barn, and there were 2 men with her, both wearing badges. Garrett urged his horse faster, fear spiking through him. Had something happened? Was she in trouble? "What is going on here?" he demanded, dismounting quickly. One of the lawmen turned to face him, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache. "You Garrett Jenkins?" "I am. What is this about?" "We need to ask Miss Norris some questions about property that went missing after her husband's robbery. There are still outstanding questions about where the money from that bank job ended up." "I already told you," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "I do not know anything about the money. My husband did not tell me what he was planning, and I never saw a dime of what he stole." "That is what you say," the second lawman replied. "But we have got to investigate every lead. The bank wants its money back, and you are the most logical person to have information about where it might be." "She has been here for a month," Garrett said, "working from dawn to dark every single day." "Does that sound like someone sitting on stolen bank money? Maybe she is hiding her time, waiting for things to cool down before she makes a move." "That is ridiculous," Garrett said flatly. "You are harassing her because she is an easy target, someone everyone already decided is guilty just because of who she was married to." The first lawman's expression hardened. "You might want to be careful about who you defend, Jenkins. Interfering with an investigation is a serious matter. And false accusations are slander. She has answered your questions. Unless you have evidence that she committed a crime, I am going to have to ask you to leave my property." The 2 lawmen exchanged glances. Finally, the first one said, "We will be keeping an eye on things. If that money turns up, we will know where to look." They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Garrett and Margaret standing in tense silence. Garrett could see that she was shaking, her hands clenched at her sides. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, but her voice betrayed her. "This is not the first time they have questioned me, probably will not be the last. They have no right to harass you like this. They have every right. I am the widow of a criminal. That makes me suspicious in their eyes, guilty until proven innocent." Margaret took a shaky breath. "Garrett, maybe I should leave. This is getting out of hand. First the gossip affecting your business in town, now lawmen showing up at your ranch. I am causing you nothing but trouble." "No," Garrett said firmly. "You are not leaving. We are in this together now. But it is not fair to you. You took a chance on me, gave me work when no one else would, and I am repaying you by destroying your reputation and bringing the law to your door." Garrett stepped closer to her, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Margaret, listen to me. You have not destroyed anything. You have helped save this ranch, given me hope again when I had almost none left. Whatever problems come from small-minded people who cannot see past their own prejudice, that is on them, not you. I am not letting you go." "Why?" she asked, the word barely more than a whisper. "Why are you willing to risk so much for me?" The answer came to Garrett with sudden clarity, words he had been avoiding but could no longer deny. "Because I care about you, not just as someone who works for me, but as a person, maybe more than I should given the circumstances. But that is the truth of it. Having you here has changed everything for me, and I am not willing to go back to how things were before." Margaret stared at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise and something else, something that looked like hope. "Garrett," before she could finish, they heard the sound of another horse approaching. Garrett bit back a curse at the interruption. It seemed like the whole world was conspiring to intrude on his property today. But when he saw who was riding up the path, his irritation shifted to curiosity. It was Thomas Murray, a lawyer from Johnson City whom Garrett knew only slightly. "Mr. Jenkins," Thomas called out as he dismounted, "forgive my unannounced visit. I was hoping I might have a word with you and Miss Norris." "What is this about?" Garrett asked warily. Thomas was a young man, probably not much past 30, with an earnest face and intelligent eyes. He pulled a document from his saddlebag. "It is about the allegations against Miss Norris regarding the bank robbery. I represent a client who has information that may be relevant to clearing her name." Margaret's breath caught. "What kind of information? May we go inside? This is not a conversation for standing in the heat." They moved into the house, and Thomas settled at the table, spreading out papers in front of him. "My client is a man named Samuel Hayes. He was an associate of your late husband, Miss Norris, and he is currently serving time for a separate crime. He has come forward with a statement that your husband acted alone in the bank robbery and that you had no knowledge of his plans or the location of the stolen money." "Why would he come forward now?" Garrett asked. "Hayes is dying," Thomas said soberly. "Consumption. He has decided to make peace with various matters before the end, and apparently the treatment of Miss Norris has been weighing on his conscience. His testimony, combined with the lack of any actual evidence against you, Miss Norris, should be sufficient to officially clear you of any suspicion." Margaret sat down heavily, her hand pressed to her mouth. "I do not understand. I never met Samuel Hayes. Why would he care what happens to me?" "He said your husband spoke of you, apparently felt guilty for what his actions would do to your life. Hayes never met you either, but he felt that providing this testimony was the least he could do to make partial amends for his own criminal past." Thomas pushed one of the documents across the table. "This is an affidavit from Hayes, sworn and witnessed. I have already filed it with the court and provided copies to the county sheriff and the bank that was robbed. As far as the law is concerned, you are cleared of any involvement or suspicion. The bank may not be happy about it, since they still have not recovered their money, but they have no grounds to pursue you further." Garrett watched as tears finally spilled down Margaret's cheeks, 8 months of strain and fear and accusation finally releasing. "I can hardly believe it. After all this time, after everything." "Believe it," Thomas said gently. "You are free, Miss Norris. Your husband's crimes no longer define you in the eyes of the law." After Thomas left, taking his documents and good wishes with him, Garrett and Margaret sat together at the table in stunned silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I am free. I can go anywhere, do anything. I am not chained to the past anymore. What do you want to do?" Garrett asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. Now that she was cleared, would she still want to stay on his struggling ranch, or would she take this opportunity to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere she did not carry the weight of local gossip and prejudice. Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes still wet but her expression clear. "Before we were interrupted, you said something to me, that you cared about me maybe more than you should. Did you mean that?" Garrett's heart was pounding, but he met her gaze steadily. "I meant every word." "I care about you too," Margaret said. "These past weeks working beside you, getting to know you, I have felt something growing that I did not expect. After my husband, after everything that happened, I thought I would never trust anyone again, never want to open my heart to the risk. But you are different, Garrett. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And more than that, you have treated me with respect and kindness without expecting anything in return." "I want something in return now," Garrett admitted. "I want you to stay, not because you are working for me, but because you want to be here. Because you want to build something with me, not just a successful ranch, but a life together." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "I want that too. I want to stay, Garrett. I want to see what we can build together." Garrett pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her close. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapping around his waist. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, feeling the rightness of it. When they finally pulled apart, Garrett could not help smiling. "So what happens now?" "Now we get back to work," Margaret said practically, though she was smiling too. "We still have a ranch to save, fences to mend, cattle to tend, but we do it together as partners in every sense." "Partners," Garrett agreed. "I like the sound of that." The revelation of Margaret's legal clearance did not immediately change the attitudes of everyone in town, but it shifted things enough to matter. The sheriff made a point of stopping by the ranch to personally apologize for the harassment Margaret had endured, and word spread through Johnson City that she had been officially exonerated. The general store owner grudgingly restored Garrett's credit, though his manner remained cool. Other people in town were slower to change their opinions, but the simple fact that Margaret was no longer under suspicion took the edge off the gossip. Garrett and Margaret continued working on the ranch, but everything felt different now, colored by the acknowledgement of what they meant to each other. They were more careful about observing proprieties, aware that people were still watching, but in private moments, they allowed themselves the small intimacies of a developing relationship. Hands held across the table during meals, sitting close together on the porch in the evenings, stolen kisses when no one else was around to see. As summer progressed toward fall, the ranch began to show real signs of improvement. The cattle were in better condition, well fed and carefully managed. The fences were repaired and reinforced. They even managed to scrape together enough money to hire help for 2 weeks to work on the barn roof, getting it reinforced before the winter weather arrived. Every project completed felt like a small victory, proof that their combined efforts were making a real difference. In September, Garrett and Margaret drove the cattle to market in Fort Worth. It was a hard 3-day journey, but they worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's movements and supporting each other through the challenges of keeping the herd moving. When the cattle were finally sold, Garrett got a better price than he had dared hope for, enough to pay off his debts, buy supplies for winter, and have a modest amount left over for improvements. Standing in the dusty stock pens with the payment securely in hand, Garrett felt something close to relief for the first time in years. "We did it," he said to Margaret. "We actually pulled this off." "We did," Margaret agreed, her face flushed with triumph and exhaustion. "This is just the beginning, Garrett. Next year will be even better." On the journey back to the ranch, Garrett found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not allowed himself to before. He had spent so long just trying to survive, to hold on to his father's legacy by his fingernails, that he had forgotten what it felt like to actually plan for good things ahead. Now, with Margaret beside him, the future looked full of possibility rather than dread. They were a day out from home, camped under the stars, when Garrett finally found the courage to say what had been on his mind for weeks. "Margaret, I know we have not been courting for very long in the traditional sense. Most of our time together has been spent working rather than anything romantic. But I know my own heart, and I know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Margaret looked up from the fire they had built, her face glowing in the flickering light. "Are you sure?" "Marriage to me will not be easy. There will always be people who remember my past, who judge me for things I did not do. There will also be people who see you for who you really are, a strong, capable, amazing woman who deserves every good thing life has to offer. I want to be your husband, Margaret. I want to build a life and a family with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are beside me, not because I employed you, but because you chose me." "I did choose you," Margaret said, moving around the fire to sit beside him. "From the moment you offered me work when no one else would, from the first time you defended me against gossip and suspicion, from every day we have spent working side by side. I choose you, Garrett. Yes, I will marry you." Garrett kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We should do this properly," Garrett said. "I want to get you a ring, have a real wedding with witnesses. I want everyone to know that you are my wife, that we are building this life together. As long as I am with you, I do not care about the details," Margaret said. "But yes, let us do it properly. Let us show everyone that we have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." They married a month later in the small church in Johnson City. The ceremony was modest, attended by the few friends and acquaintances who had remained supportive through everything. Thomas Murray, the lawyer who had brought the news of Margaret's exoneration, served as a witness. The sheriff and his wife came as well, their presence a statement of official acceptance that Garrett appreciated. Margaret wore a simple dress she had made herself, white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She looked beautiful, her dark hair pinned up, and her gray eyes shining with happiness. When Garrett slipped the gold ring on her finger, a ring he had saved for weeks to afford, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him, as though everything in his life had been leading to this moment. After the ceremony, they returned to the ranch, to the house that would now be truly theirs together. Garrett carried Margaret over the threshold and she laughed, her arms around his neck. "We are really married," she said, as though testing out the words. "We really are, Mrs. Jenkins." That night, they consummated their marriage, learning each other in the intimate ways of husband and wife. It was tender and passionate, a physical expression of everything they had come to feel for each other. Afterward, lying in Garrett's bed that was now their shared bed, Margaret traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "I never thought I could be this happy again. After everything that happened with my first husband, I thought that part of my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days alone. You will never be alone again," Garrett promised. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The first winter of their marriage was hard but manageable. They had prepared well, laying in supplies and making sure the cattle had access to shelter and supplemental feed. The ranch house, which had seemed so empty and cheerless when Garrett lived there alone, became a warm refuge with Margaret in it. She had a talent for creating comfort from very little, making their home a place of real happiness. In the spring, they discovered Margaret was pregnant. The news brought a mixture of joy and worry. Garrett was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father but anxious about what childbirth might mean for Margaret. She, however, seemed to take it in stride, continuing her work on the ranch with only minor concessions to her changing condition. "I am pregnant, not dying," she said when Garrett tried to insist she rest more. "Women have been having babies while running farms and ranches since the beginning of time. I will be fine." The pregnancy progressed without serious complications, though the summer heat made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable. Garrett did his best to take on the heavier work, hiring occasional help when he could afford it. The ranch continued to improve, the herd growing as calves were born and carefully tended. In late September, as the leaves on the few trees near the house were just beginning to turn, Margaret went into labor. Garrett had arranged for a midwife from town to be available, and she arrived in time to help with the delivery. It was a long, difficult process that left Garrett pacing anxiously in the main room, listening to Margaret's labored breathing and occasional cries from the bedroom upstairs. Finally, just as the sun was setting, he heard the thin wail of a newborn baby. The midwife appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Jenkins. A big, healthy boy. Your wife did wonderfully." Garrett took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the bedroom to find Margaret propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Garrett approached the bed almost reverently, looking down at the small red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small fussy noises. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered. "He is ours," Margaret said. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names but never quite decided. Looking at his son now, Garrett thought of his own father, of the legacy and dreams that had driven George Jenkins to build this ranch. "What about Henry? It was my grandfather's name, Henry James Jenkins." "Henry," Margaret repeated, smiling. "I like that. Hello, Henry. Welcome to your home." The midwife stayed for a few days to help Margaret recover and teach Garrett the basics of caring for an infant. It was overwhelming and exhausting and wonderful all at once. Garrett found himself amazed by how something so small could so completely transform everything, could make him feel protective and terrified and joyful in equal measure. As Margaret regained her strength, they settled into a new rhythm, balancing ranch work with the demands of a baby. It was harder than anything they had done before, managing cattle and fences and endless chores while also ensuring Henry was fed, changed, and cared for. But they managed it together, taking turns and supporting each other through the sleepless nights and challenging days. The years that followed were marked by steady progress and growing happiness. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known as one of the more successful small operations in the area. Garrett was able to gradually expand the herd and make improvements to the property, adding a new barn and even hiring permanent help as they could afford it. Margaret proved to be as skilled a mother as she was a rancher, raising Henry with a perfect balance of love and discipline. The boy grew strong and curious, following his parents around the ranch as soon as he could walk, wanting to help with everything. When Henry was 3, Margaret became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because they knew what to expect, and because Margaret was not trying to prove she could handle everything herself. In the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Grace. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she ruled the household from the moment she arrived. Garrett sometimes stood on his porch in the evenings, watching Margaret play with their children in the yard, and marveled at how completely his life had changed. He thought back to that desperate day in Johnson City when he had approached a struggling woman with a carpetbag, offering work when no one else would. He remembered her words, "I will not let you down." She had kept that promise 1,000 times over, in ways neither of them could have imagined then. The gossip that had once swirled around them faded as the years passed, and their success became undeniable. People who had shunned Margaret began to greet her respectfully in town. The store owner who had cut off Garrett's credit now went out of his way to be helpful. Even Walter Price, the neighbor who had once warned Garrett about his reputation, eventually came around, acknowledging that the Jenkins ranch was well managed and prosperous. But Garrett and Margaret did not need validation from others. They had built something real together, something that went far beyond a successful ranch. They had created a family, a life full of love and purpose and shared dreams. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Garrett gave Margaret a new gold ring to wear alongside her wedding band, this one engraved with words only they would understand. "You never let me down." Margaret cried when she read the inscription, happy tears that she did not bother to hide. "Neither did you," she said, kissing him. "You saw me when I was invisible, believed in me when no one else did. You gave me a future when I thought I had none." "We gave each other a future," Garrett corrected. "Everything good in my life started the day I met you." As Henry and Sarah grew older, they were brought into the work of the ranch, learning the skills and values their parents had to teach. Henry showed a natural talent with horses and cattle, while Sarah had her mother's head for organization and planning. Together, they represented the future of the Jenkins Ranch, the living proof that something worthwhile could be built through hard work, determination, and love. In 1885, when Henry was 7 and Sarah 4, the family welcomed another child, a son they named Thomas after the lawyer who had helped clear Margaret's name. Thomas Murray had remained a friend over the years, and he was honored to have the boy named after him. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. What had once been a struggling operation on the edge of failure became a respected and successful enterprise. Garrett was able to buy additional land, expanding their grazing territory. They built a new, larger house, though they kept the original structure as a bunkhouse for hired hands. The barn was replaced with a modern facility that was the envy of other ranchers in the area. Through it all, Garrett and Margaret remained partners in every sense, working side by side and making decisions together. Their love, which had begun in such unlikely circumstances, only grew stronger with time. They had weathered hardships and celebrated triumphs, raised children and built a legacy, and they had done it all together. On evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed, they still sat on the porch as they had in those early days, talking about their day and making plans for tomorrow. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build into something worthwhile. "Do you ever think about that day in Johnson City?" Margaret asked one such evening, years after it had happened. "When you walked up to me and offered me work, I think about it often," Garrett admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up, to selling the ranch and admitting defeat. If I had done that just one day earlier, I never would have met you. I think about it too. I was so desperate that day, so tired of being rejected and judged. I had started to believe that I would never escape the shadow of my husband's crimes, that I was condemned to carry that burden forever. And then you appeared, offering not just work but respect, treating me like a person rather than a problem. You said you would not let me down," Garrett reminded her. "And I have tried every day to keep that promise," Margaret said. "But you did something for me too, Garrett. You gave me back my life. You helped me become someone other than a criminal's widow. You made me a wife, a mother, a partner in building something good and lasting." Garrett pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other," he said. "That is what matters." As the years continued to pass, the Jenkins family became a pillar of the community. Margaret's past was largely forgotten, remembered only as a story of hardship overcome and redemption earned. Garrett was recognized as a successful rancher and a good man, someone who had built a thriving operation through intelligence and hard work. Henry grew into a fine young man, steady and capable, ready to one day take over the family ranch. Sarah proved to have a talent for business, helping her mother manage the financial aspects of the operation. Young Thomas was still finding his way, but he showed promise in everything he attempted. In 1890, as the Wild West era was drawing to a close and a new century loomed on the horizon, Garrett and Margaret celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. They held a large party at the ranch, inviting friends, neighbors, and even some of the people who had once shunned them. It was a celebration not just of their marriage, but of everything they had accomplished together. Standing before the gathered crowd, Garrett raised his glass in a toast. "10 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She came into my life when both of us were struggling, when the future looked dark and uncertain. Together, we built something neither of us could have created alone. This ranch, our family, the life we share, all of it exists because we took a chance on each other. So here is to Margaret, my wife, my partner, my love. Thank you for never letting me down." Margaret stood beside him, tears in her eyes but smiling. "And thank you for seeing me when I needed to be seen, for believing in me when no one else would. Everything I am today, everything we have built, started with your kindness and faith. I love you, Garrett Jenkins." They kissed while their friends and family applauded, their children cheering the loudest. It was a perfect moment, the culmination of a decade of hard work, love, and determination. As the party continued around them, Garrett and Margaret slipped away for a few moments alone, walking hand in hand to the edge of their property where they could look out over the land they had worked so hard to make successful. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the same colors that had marked that first evening they had shared a meal and begun to know each other. "You remember what you told me that first night?" Margaret asked. "You said your father would be disappointed to see how you had struggled with the ranch." "I remember. What do you think he would say if he could see it now?" Garrett considered the question, looking out over the prosperous land, the healthy cattle, the solid buildings, the family he had created. "I think he would be proud, not just of the ranch but of everything. The life we have built, the way we have raised our children, the respect we have earned. This is what he dreamed of when he bought this land, a lasting legacy." "Then we have honored his dream," Margaret said, "and built our own in the process." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other when both were lost, who had built something beautiful from struggle and hardship. The Wild West was changing around them, becoming more settled and civilized, but the values that had guided them remained constant. Hard work, determination, faith in each other, and love that grew stronger with every challenge overcome. Years later, when Garrett and Margaret were in their 50s and their children were grown with families of their own, they still worked the ranch together. Henry had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, but Garrett and Margaret remained active, passing on their knowledge and experience to the next generation. Sarah had married a lawyer from Fort Worth and was raising 4 children while also helping manage the business side of the ranch. Thomas had become a skilled horse trainer, developing a reputation that brought buyers from across Texas. The original ranch house, where Garrett had lived alone in such loneliness, and where he had brought Margaret as his employee, still stood as a bunkhouse for hired hands. Sometimes Garrett and Margaret would walk through it, remembering those early days when everything had been uncertain and precarious. "I was so scared then," Margaret confessed during one such visit. "Trying to hide it, trying to be strong, but terrified that it would all fall apart, that I would end up alone and desperate again." "I was scared too," Garrett admitted. "Afraid I was failing my father's legacy, afraid I would lose the ranch, afraid to believe things could get better. And then you arrived, and everything changed." They stood in what had been Margaret's room, looking out the window at the view she had seen on her first day at the ranch. So much had changed since then, but the essential landscape remained the same, the harsh beauty of Texas ranchland that had tested them and shaped them. "I would do it all again," Margaret said. "Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear or doubt. It all led us here, to this life we have built together." "So would I," Garrett agreed. "Every single moment." As the new century approached, Garrett and Margaret began to step back from the ranch operations, letting their children take on more responsibility. They had earned their rest, earned the right to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. They traveled a bit, visiting cities they had never seen, but they always came home to the ranch, to the land that had been the foundation of their life together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a massive celebration. Friends and family came from across Texas and beyond. The governor sent a letter of congratulation, recognizing the Jenkins family's contributions to the state's agricultural development. Local newspapers ran stories about the ranch and the remarkable partnership that had built it. But for Garrett and Margaret, the greatest joy was simply being surrounded by the family they had created. Henry and his wife had 3 children, with another on the way. Sarah's 4 children ranged from teenagers to toddlers, each showing the intelligence and determination of their grandmother. Thomas had recently married and was talking about starting a family of his own. Looking around at all these faces, the children and grandchildren who existed because 2 desperate people had taken a chance on each other in Johnson City so many years ago, Garrett felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had been hard, often brutally so, but it had also been generous, giving him far more than he had ever dreamed possible. In his 70s, Garrett's health began to fail. The decades of hard physical labor had taken their toll, and a weakness in his heart began to limit what he could do. Margaret cared for him with the same dedication she had brought to everything else in their life together, managing his medicines, making sure he rested, and simply being present whenever he needed her. "You should not have to spend your time taking care of an old man," Garrett said one afternoon as she brought him tea on the porch where he spent most of his days now. "After everything you have done for me, after the life you gave me, this is the least I can do," Margaret replied. "Besides, I am not ready to lose you yet, Garrett Jenkins. We still have too much living to do." He smiled at her stubborn determination, loving her more than ever. "I am a lucky man. We are lucky together." Garrett lived for 3 more years, long enough to see 2 more grandchildren born, long enough to celebrate his and Margaret's 30th wedding anniversary. He died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, with Margaret beside him as she had been for so many nights before. Margaret grieved deeply, as was natural after losing a partner she had loved for 30 years. But she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that stood as a testament to what she and Garrett had built together, and in the knowledge that they had made the most of the time they had been given. She lived for another 15 years after Garrett's death, remaining active and sharp until the very end. She continued to offer advice on ranch operations, played with her great-grandchildren, and never tired of telling stories about the early days, about how she and Garrett had found each other when both were lost. When Margaret finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 81, the whole community mourned. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testimony to the respect and affection she had earned over a lifetime. She was buried beside Garrett on a hill overlooking the ranch, the two of them together again. In the years and decades that followed, the Jenkins Ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants. The story of Garrett and Margaret became a family legend, passed down through generations. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the lonely rancher who had taken a chance on a woman no one else would hire, about how she had promised not to let him down, and about how that simple act of faith had created a legacy that endured. The original ranch house was eventually preserved as a historical site, with a plaque that told the story of Garrett and Margaret Jenkins. Visitors came to see it, to walk through the rooms where their love story had begun, to stand on the porch where they had sat so many evenings planning their future. The land itself remained productive and beautiful, carefully stewarded by each generation as it had been by the first. The cattle that grazed on those pastures were descendants of the herd that Garrett and Margaret had worked so hard to improve. The fences they had mended were long since replaced, but their impact remained, the strong foundations that had allowed everything else to flourish. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Texas hills in shades of orange and purple, those who lived on the land could almost feel the presence of Garrett and Margaret, the two people who had loved each other enough to believe in impossible dreams, who had worked hard enough to make those dreams real, and who had built a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their story was one of love found in unlikely circumstances, of faith rewarded and promises kept, of two broken people who had healed each other and created something beautiful in the process. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest things in life begin with a simple act of kindness, with one person seeing another when the rest of the world looks away, with the courage to say, "I will not let you down," and the determination to keep that promise no matter what challenges arise. In the end, that was the true legacy of Garrett and Margaret Jenkins, not just the successful ranch or the family they raised, but the example they set of what two people could accomplish when they faced life together with love, determination, and an unwavering belief in each other. Their story became part of the fabric of Texas history, a testament to the power of second chances and the transformative nature of genuine love.